Eleanor Winters, Duchess of Alderley, did not drop the invoice. She did not ask the footman to repeat himself. She did not sit down, though there was a chair 3 feet behind her, and her knees had gone quietly to water. She read the paper a second time, because the first reading had surely been a mistake of ink, and the second time the numbers stood exactly where they had stood before, £400, her quarterly allowance, drawn against her name and delivered in full to a modiste on Bond Street, itemised against 6 gowns, 2 cloaks, and a set of pearl-trimmed slippers, all consigned to a Mrs. Sophia Renshaw, of Shalcott Street. Eleanor folded the invoice in half, then in half again, with the particular care of a woman handling something that might otherwise cut her, and set it on the hall table with both hands flat, as though she were pressing down a lid. By morning she would know exactly how long this had been going on, and by autumn the county would know it too, and the man who had signed nothing and noticed nothing would spend the rest of his life learning the difference between a wife who was useful and a wife who was simply, finally, done being invisible. The spring of 1815 had come to Alderley the way it always did, indifferent to the households it moved through, waking the orchards and the tenant disputes in the same careless breath. Eleanor had been Duchess for 3 years by then, married in a transaction so plain that no one had bothered to dress it as anything else. Her father's estate carried debt the size of a small war, and Gideon Marsh, Duke of Alderley, carried land that wanted a steady hand and an heir it did not yet have. She had brought the first. She had not yet been asked, in any way that counted, to bring herself. She had learned Alderley's ledgers before she had learned its corridors. She corrected the drainage accounts in her first winter, quietly, without credit, because the steward had been rounding figures in his own favour for a decade, and no one else had thought to check. She settled 2 tenant boundary disputes by walking the fences herself with a surveyor's chain, in mud, in a gown she later burned rather than clean. She wrote every letter of condolence, every letter of congratulation, every letter that kept the Marsh name warm in a county that had never much liked the cold father who preceded Gideon. None of it was seen, because all of it worked, and the particular tragedy of competent women is that their success looks, from a distance, exactly like nothing happening at all. Gideon Marsh she had married a stranger, and remained married to one. He was not unkind. He was not cruel in the way the county sometimes murmured cruelty into unhappy marriages, with raised hands or raised voices. He was simply absent in the particular way of a man standing in a room with the door shut behind his own eyes. He gave her a household to run, an allowance to spend as she wished, and nothing else, no confidences, no evenings, no question that reached past the state of the harvest. She had stopped, somewhere in the 2nd year, waiting for the door to open. She had not stopped noticing that it stayed shut. There was, at the edge of the county's polite conversation, a name that surfaced and submerged like a stone in a slow river. Mrs. Sophia Renshaw, a widow of good bearing and thinner means, who had known Gideon before Eleanor had known anyone at all, and who had never quite left the margins of his life the way a settled man's old attachments are supposed to. Eleanor had heard the name perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, always sideways, always followed by someone changing the subject with the particular haste of people protecting a secret they are not sure is theirs to keep. She had not gone looking for proof. Proof had come looking for her, delivered by a footman who had simply read the direction on the outside of the parcel and assumed, reasonably, that anything billed to her Grace's account belonged in her Grace's hands. It arrived on the afternoon of the Alderley Harvest Assembly, 6 hours before she was required to stand at her husband's side and receive the whole county with a face that gave nothing away, which was, she thought, folding the invoice a third time before she finally put it in her writing desk and turned the key, going to be very much easier than anyone in this house currently believed. The assembly hall at Alderley had been dressed in the ordinary manner of harvest nights, greenery along the mantels, the long tables cleared for dancing, candles enough to make every face in the county look forgiving. Eleanor stood beside her husband at the receiving line for 40 minutes and greeted 40 families by name, by the names of their children, by the state of their crops, because she had made it her business over 3 years to know these things when no one had asked her to. Gideon greeted them beside her with the practised warmth of a man reciting a speech he had given many times, and did not once glance down to see that her hands, folded at her waist, were perfectly still. Mrs. Sophia Renshaw arrived at 8 o'clock, on the arm of her brother, in a gown of deep blue silk with pearl-trimmed slippers showing beneath the hem, and Eleanor recognised the gown before she recognised the woman wearing it, because she had read its price that afternoon in her own hand's careful arithmetic. 6 gowns, 2 cloaks, 1 set of slippers. £400. Her allowance, walking across the floor of her own husband's hall. She did not make a scene. She had already decided, somewhere between the writing desk and the stairs, that a scene was exactly what this house expected of a wounded woman, and she intended to give this house nothing it expected ever again. She watched Mrs. Renshaw curtsy to the room with the particular ease of someone who had rehearsed belonging, and she watched her husband's eyes move to the blue silk and hold there a half-second longer than courtesy required, and she filed the half-second away in the same drawer of the mind where she had, over 3 years, filed a great many other things she had chosen not to examine by candlelight. It was near 10, in the brief lull between the second dance and the third, that she heard her own classification spoken aloud. She had stepped behind the pillared alcove near the card-room to adjust a slipping comb, and through the gap in the drapery she heard Lord Pell, her husband's uncle and oldest confidant, murmur something about the Duchess's steadiness, and heard Gideon answer in the low, satisfied voice of a man discussing a well-chosen horse. "She has never once asked me for more than her due," he said. "No scenes, no tears, no demands beyond the ordinary. She is sensible, not sentimental. That is precisely what I required in a wife." Eleanor stood very still behind the drapery. She did not gasp. She did not press a hand to her mouth. She had in fact the strange clear sensation of hearing a verdict read in a courtroom she had not known she was standing trial in, and finding that she agreed with the evidence, if not the sentence. Sensible, not sentimental. Precisely what he required. Not a wife. A requirement, met, she reached up and drew the pearl comb from her hair, the comb his mother had once worn, given to her on her wedding morning by Gideon's own hand, though not, she understood now with sudden and complete clarity, with any warmth attached to the giving, only the discharge of an obligation, the way one hands over a key to a house one does not intend to live in. She held it a moment in the candlelight. Then she set it down on the narrow table beside the alcove, with both hands, gently, the way a person sets down something they intend never to need again, in quite the same way. She did not weep. She did not seek out her husband to demand an accounting. She went instead to find her aunt, Prudence Coulter, who had come up from Somerset for the assembly, and who was, at that moment, eating cake with the frank satisfaction of a woman who had never once in her life required anyone's approval to enjoy herself. "You've gone the colour of good linen," Prudence said, not looking up from her plate. "Sit, I am not going to sit," Eleanor said. "I am going to count, and then I am going to work." "Count what?" "Minutes." Eleanor drew out the small ivory-cased watch she kept always in her sleeve, the one her mother had left her along with a great many maxims and very little money. "I am allowing myself 20 minutes to feel whatever this is. After that it goes in the drawer, and I do not open the drawer again until I have use for what's in it." Prudence set down her fork. "Your mother used to do that." "My mother," Eleanor said, "used to say a ledger doesn't lie. But people do, so keep both." She looked once, briefly, across the hall, to where her husband stood laughing at something Lord Pell had said, entirely unaware that the ground beneath his marriage had just shifted a foot to the left. "I intend to keep both, Aunt, starting tonight." She used her 20 minutes standing at the window of the small retiring room, watching the last light go out of the west field. And when the watch's hand reached its mark, she closed it, with a small, definite click, the way one closes a door on a room no longer needed, and went back into the hall with her spine straight and her face composed, and not one single tear anywhere upon it. £400 had bought Sophia Renshaw 6 gowns. It had not, Eleanor thought, walking back into the candlelight, bought her anything else at all, not standing, not safety, not the particular kind of ground a woman builds under her own 2 feet when she stops waiting to be given one. By the second morning after the assembly, Eleanor had done 3 things no one in the household expected of a grieving wife, because she had decided, quite deliberately, not to be one. She had written to her father's old solicitor, Mr. Bexley, requesting a private meeting regarding the disposition of her marriage settlement, the money that was, by law and by the particular clause her father had insisted upon before the wedding, entirely her own to direct. She had gone through the estate office's disbursement book, page by page, in the hour before the steward, Mr. Halloway, arrived for the day, and she had begun, in a plain hand in a plain notebook she kept in her own writing desk, a list. The list began simply, £400, quarter-ending Lady Day, paid to Bond Street, consigned Mrs. S. Renshaw. Beneath it she wrote the date of the previous quarter, and beneath that the quarter before, working backward through 18 months of the estate's disbursement records until the pattern stopped looking like an accident and started looking like an architecture. The allowance had never once, in that year and a half, reached her own hands in full. Small sums had come to her, enough that she had never thought to question it. A woman with a full household to run rarely counts her own pin money as carefully as she counts the tenants', while the larger portion had been drawn, quarter after quarter, against an authorization she had never signed, to an address she had never visited, for goods she had never worn. She did not confront Mr. Halloway directly. She had learned, in 3 years of managing a house full of men who assumed her attention was decorative, that the surest way to lose a piece of information was to announce you possessed it. Instead, she asked him, over the estate office desk on a wet Tuesday, a series of small, dry questions about the drainage, works on the eastern boundary, a competence trial with real numbers, the kind she had run a dozen times before, the kind that had, over 3 years, quietly converted every tenant on the estate from sceptic to advocate. "The eastern culvert has silted twice this spring," she said. Twice at a cost of £11 each time to clear. "I should like to know why we are paying to clear a culvert that a proper stone lining would have solved for 30, once, permanently." Halloway shifted in his chair. "His Grace has not authorized the expenditure, Your Grace." "His Grace," Eleanor said, "authorizes very little that does not come to him already decided. I am deciding it. £30 against the Eastern account, Miss, Halloway, and I should like the stonemason engaged by Friday. He did engage the mason by Friday, because he had learned, over the preceding 18 months, that the Duchess's small dry questions had an uncomfortable habit of being followed by accounts that balanced better than they had before she asked them. What Eleanor noticed, watching him leave the office with the ledger under his arm, was the particular flicker of a man recalculating how much he was known, the same flicker, though she did not yet have proof enough to name it plainly, of a man who kept 2 sets of figures and had just realised someone might be reading both. Word of the culvert, and of the harvest accounts she had reorganised the autumn before, and of the fair wage she had quietly insisted be paid to the hedgers when Halloway had tried to shave a shilling from each man's week, moved through the tenant cottages the way water moves downhill, finding every low place and filling it. By midsummer, the farmers who had once tipped their hats to the Duchess out of obligation were tipping them out of something closer to loyalty, and a loyalty like that, Eleanor understood, was worth a great deal more to a woman building a case than any allowance could be. Gideon noticed her before he understood what he was noticing. It began with small things, the eastern culvert, holding through a hard rain that would once have flooded the low pasture, a tenant, old Corbett. Thanking him at the gate for a kindness Gideon had not personally extended, and had to work out, walking home, was in fact his wife's doing entirely. He began watching her across the dinner table with the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes, adding up 3 years of a woman he had married for convenience, and finding the sum did not match the ledger entry he had filed her under. "You reorganised the harvest wages," he said one evening, not quite a question. "I did." Halloway did not mention it. "Halloway," Eleanor said, buttering her bread with perfect composure, "mentions a great many things imperfectly." Gideon set down his fork. "Is there something you wish to say to me, Eleanor?" There was a great deal she wished to say to him. She had, at that point, 6 weeks of careful arithmetic sitting in a locked drawer, and a comb still resting untouched on the alcove table where a housemaid had. Out of confusion, left it rather than return it to a Duchess who had made her intentions plain by walking away from it. But 6 weeks of arithmetic was not yet a case, and a case, her mother's voice reminded her, is not built from suspicion. It is built from paper. "Nothing," she said, "that isn't already in the accounts, if a person cares to read them." He looked at her a long moment, the almost smile, she would think later, the first rung of a ladder neither of them yet knew they were climbing, and said nothing further, and the silence between them that evening was, for the first time in 3 years, not entirely empty. The truth of Gideon Marsh's coldness surfaced not from him, but from his sister, Lady Charlotte, 4 years his junior, and married the previous spring to a baronet 2 counties over, came to stay at Alderley in high summer, and found Eleanor in the estate office at 10 in the evening, adding a column of figures by candlelight, with the grim patience of a woman who intended to finish before she slept. "You work like our mother used to," Charlotte said, settling into the chair opposite without being asked, which Eleanor had come to recognise as the particular courtesy of people who liked you enough not to require permission. "I never met your mother." No one did, in the end. That's rather the point. Charlotte turned a paperweight over in her hands, not quite looking at Eleanor. "Our father sent her away when Gideon was 12. There was an accusation, infidelity, though I have never in my life seen a shred of proof of it. Only a man who wanted an excuse, and a wife too proud to defend herself against one. Uncle Pell raised Gideon after that. taught him that a man who lets a woman close enough to matter is a man handing her the knife. Keep the wife for the land, he used to say. Keep the rest of yourself elsewhere, where it's safer. Charlotte set the paperweight down. I don't say it to excuse him, Eleanor. I say it because I don't think he has ever once, in 3 years, understood that what he was taught to call safety, you might reasonably call being left in the cold. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, not because she was unmoved, but because she was recalculating, the way she recalculated a column that had returned an unexpected sum. Explained was not excused. She intended to hold that distinction the way she held every other piece of evidence, carefully, and for later use. Holloway's countermove came in August, in the form of a note delivered to Eleanor's own hand, unsigned, warning her in a cramped, careful script that certain persons in the county would find it distressing to learn how closely the Duchess had lately been examining accounts that were, properly, none of a wife's concern. Eleanor read it twice, then added it, dated and folded, to the growing collection in her locked drawer. Fear, she noted in her private list beside the entry, is not the same as innocence. A man who has done nothing wrong does not warn a woman off his ledgers. The county, meanwhile, had begun, quietly, the way these things always begin, to speak of the Duchess of Alderley with a different weight than it once had. Not pity any longer, something closer to attention. The midpoint came, as these things so often do, without any trumpet to announce it, only a locked door, opened on an ordinary Tuesday in September. Gideon had never once, in 3 years, invited Eleanor into his study. It was the one room at Alderley that remained entirely his, kept as his father had kept it, heavy with old ledgers and older silences, and Eleanor had long since stopped wondering what was behind its door, because wondering had never once been rewarded. So when he opened it himself, that afternoon, and stood in the frame with his hand still on the latch, and said, "Will you come in?" she understood at once that something in the house had shifted its weight. He had, on the desk, a small rosewood box she had never seen. He opened it without ceremony, and took from it a folded letter, brittle at its creases, and beside it, to her genuine astonishment, the pearl comb, retrieved, she realised, from the alcove table where she had left it in July, kept these 2 months in this locked room rather than returned to a drawer or given back to a housemaid to dispose of. "This was my mother's," he said of the comb, though she had known that much already. "She gave it to my father's mother before she left. It came to me. I gave it to you the morning we married because it was expected, and because I did not know then what else a comb was for." He set it on the desk between them. "I have thought about that a great deal these last 2 months, watching you fix a culvert I hadn't authorised, and pay wages I hadn't ordered, and hold this house together with a competence I never once thought to thank you for. I do not think I gave you that comb as anything but an obligation discharged. I am sorry for it." Eleanor did not reach for the comb, not yet. "An apology," she said, "is not the same as an explanation, Your Grace. I have had a great deal of the first, from a great many people, over the course of my life. I find I require the second considerably more." He was quiet a moment, started to speak, stopped, started again. "My father sent my mother away on an accusation I have never been able to prove or disprove, and my uncle raised me on the doctrine that a man who lets his wife close enough to wound him has failed at the one duty that matters. I have spent 3 years applying that doctrine to you without once asking whether it was true, or only convenient." He looked at her directly, which he did rarely enough that she noted it. I called you sensible instead of sentimental at the harvest assembly. I did not know you'd heard it. I have thought of little else since Charlotte told me you had. So he knew. Eleanor felt something in her chest settle, not soften, settle, the way a scale settles once both sides have finally been weighed. Then you know, she said, that I have also been counting rather more than culverts this summer. Halloway and Mrs. Renshaw's gowns, paid from an allowance you never once checked was reaching me. She let that sit in the room a moment, watching it land. I do not ask you to explain her to me tonight, Gideon. I ask you to show me, over time, that the man standing in this doorway is not the man who let his own house run for 3 years without once looking inside it. Not tonight. Not with words. Show me. All right, he said. All right, then. And for the first time in 3 years, it felt to Eleanor less like a truce and more like the opening line of a treaty both of them intended to keep. She left the comb on the desk. Not a refusal, an instruction. When he was ready to give it to her as something other than an obligation, he could bring it to her himself. The document that broke the case open was not one Eleanor found. It was one Simon Waite brought to her, unbidden, on a rainy Thursday at the estate office door, a thin, earnest young man of 19, who had clerked for the Bond Street Modest for 2 years, and had travelled, at his own expense, the better part of a day to place a folded ledger page in the Duchess's hands. I kept a copy, he said, twisting his cap, of the letter that came with the first order, Your Grace. It didn't sit right with me, the wording of it, and I've regretted a great many things in this trade, but never yet kept my mouth shut about a wrong done to a lady who never did me one. The letter, in Halloway's cramped, careful hand, instructed the modiste to bill all future orders for a Mrs. Renshaw against the Duchess of Alderley's quarterly account, citing an economy measure approved, it claimed, by His Grace's own authority, and bore, at its foot, an initial that was not. On close examination, beside 3 years of Gideon's actual correspondence that Eleanor retrieved from her own writing desk that same evening, quite his hand at all. Close, careful, not his. She brought it to Mr. Bexley the following week, along with 18 months of disbursement figures and the anonymous warning note from August, and watched the old solicitor read them twice, with the flat, procedural attention of a man who had spent 40 years finding the truth in other people's paper. This is forgery, Your Grace, he said, and embezzlement beneath it, unless I very much miss my guess. A man does not risk his position over another man's mistress out of simple loyalty. Someone has been paying Mr. Halloway to keep this arrangement quiet, and I would wager a good sum it is not His Grace. It was Mrs. Renshaw herself, cornered by her own thinning finances, who had first offered Halloway a cut of her dressmaker's credit in exchange for his silence about a small matter of tenant funds he had been shaving for years. A debt of convenience that had grown, over 18 months, into a debt of necessity, until Halloway needed Eleanor's allowance flowing quietly into Renshaw's accounts almost as badly as Renshaw needed the gowns. The counterpunch, when it came from Renshaw directly, a sworn letter delivered to 3 of the county's most prominent hostesses, alleging that the Duchess of Alderley had for months been embezzling from her own husband's estate to fund a private scheme, and would shortly be exposed for it. Eleanor read the letter Prudence brought her with the particular composure that had by now become the county's quiet legend. She has accused me, she said, of doing precisely what she has been doing to me. That is either very stupid or very brave, Aunt, and I have not yet decided which. Does it matter? Not in the slightest. Eleanor folded the letter and added it to the drawer. It only means she has made her own case for me, in her own hand, and saved me the trouble of writing it. The harvest hearing had been called, that October, for an ordinary purpose, the annual reckoning of the estate's accounts before the tenant council and the county's principal families, a tradition older than the house itself. Eleanor had asked Gideon, 3 days prior, to let her stand at the table herself, and he had said only, "It is yours to run." Run it, which was, for a man raised to keep his wife at the edge of every important room, very nearly a declaration. The hall was full by 4 o'clock, tenants along the back benches, the county families in the chairs before them, Mr. Bexley at the side table, with his papers arranged in the neat, patient stacks of a man who has done this before, and expects to be believed. Mrs. Renshaw sat near the front, in blue silk again, her composure a fraction too bright, the way ice looks brightest just before it gives. Eleanor rose when the steward's accounts were called, and did not raise her voice, because she had learned long ago that a raised voice invites an audience to doubt you, while a level one invites them to lean in. Before Mr. Halloway presents the Eastern account, she said, "I should like the council to examine 3 documents." She laid them on the table one at a time. Unhurried, the first, the disbursement record of my own quarterly allowance for the past 6 quarters. The second, a letter in Mr. Halloway's hand, authorising payment of that allowance to a Bond Street modiste on behalf of Mrs. Sophia Renshaw, under a signature purporting to be my husband's. The third, a sample of my husband's true hand, for comparison. A stillness moved through the hall, the particular stillness of a room recalculating everything it thought it knew. "That is a forgery," Halloway said too quickly, from his seat near the wall. I acted under standing instruction. "Whose instruction, Mr. Halloway?" Mr. Bexley did not look up from the papers, because the standing instruction you cite was rescinded by His Grace's father 4 years before the current Duke came into the title. I have the original beside me, if the council wishes to see it. Simon Waite rose then, from the back bench, cap in hand, unbidden and unpaid, and told the room in a plain, unhurried voice exactly what he had told the Duchess 3 weeks before, that he had carried the first order himself, that the letter had troubled him from the start, that he had kept a copy because something in him had refused to let it simply disappear. Old Corbett rose after him, uninvited, to say that the hedger's wages Halloway had tried to shave the summer past had only been made whole because the Duchess herself had caught it, and that a man who would shave a labourer's shilling was, in his own plain estimation, a man capable of shaving considerably more. Mrs. Renshaw's composure went out like a candle in a draught, not dramatically, not with tears, but with the particular visible collapse of a woman who has just understood that the room has finished deciding about her. She did not deny the gowns. She could not. The invoices bore her own address in her own hand. "I did not force him," she said finally, quietly, "to no one and everyone. He came to me first, years ago, before ever there was a Duchess to speak of." "That may be true," Eleanor said, and the hall went very still to hear her say it, because they had expected fire and were being given something colder and more exacting instead. And it changes nothing about 6 months of forged instructions and stolen tenant wages, Mrs. Renshaw. I am not here to punish you for having once been loved by my husband. I am here because you and Mr. Halloway together took bread from working men's tables and called it economy, and dressed yourself in money that was never yours to wear. She let the room absorb that, then added, evenly, I will not press for your ruin. I have the standing to, and I choose not to. You will make restitution to the tenant fund, in full, under Mr. Bexley's supervision, and you will not set foot on Alderley land again. That is mercy, Mrs. Renshaw. It costs me nothing to extend it, and it will cost you everything to have needed it. Halloway was dismissed from the estate service before the hearing closed, his own hand on the forged letter undone by nothing more dramatic than a magistrate's patient comparison of ink and slant. Something behind Sophia Renshaw's composure had gone out entirely by the time she left the hall, and did not, by every account that reached Alderley afterward, ever quite relight. Gideon had sat through the entire hearing without once speaking, watching his wife take a room the county had for 3 years mistaken for a quiet ornament, and turn it, in under an hour, into a courtroom she governed absolutely. When the hall had emptied, he found her still at the table, gathering her papers with steady hands, and said the only thing that felt adequate, which was almost nothing at all. I did not know, he said, about any of it. I want you to understand that I am not saying it to be forgiven. I am saying it because it is true, and because a man who does not know what is done in his name has failed at his name regardless of his intentions. I know you did not know, Eleanor said. That was never the accusation. The accusation was that you never thought to look. She set down the last of her papers. You called me sensible once, not sentimental, precisely what you required. She let the silence hold a moment, watching him absorb the echo of his own words return to him. I am not sensible, Gideon. I have simply never had the luxury of being anything else in this house. If you want a wife instead of a requirement, you will have to earn one, the same way I have spent 3 years earning this county's regard, slowly and in the open, and without expecting applause for it. Then tell me your terms, he said. Plainly, I will not pretend to guess them and fail. She told him that her authority over the estate's accounts, once assumed by necessity, would remain hers by right, not by his sufferance, that the fair wage she had instituted for the tenants would never again be a matter for a steward's discretion, that her name would be spoken in this house and this county as something more than sensible, that whatever remained between him and his own history, his mother, his uncle's doctrine, the cold room he had been raised to call safety, was his to unmake, and she would not do that work for him, though she would stand nearby while he did it. All right, he said. All right then. Lord Pell came to Alderley a fortnight later, at Gideon's own request, and offered Eleanor the single apology of the season that mattered most, not for the doctrine itself, which he still half believed, but for having taught a boy that love was a liability rather than a discipline, and for having, by his own admission, never once corrected the lesson once the boy became a man capable of choosing otherwise. Eleanor accepted it with the same composure she extended to everyone, and did not pretend it undid 3 years, because it did not, and pretending otherwise would only have cheapened the ledger she had kept so carefully. What followed was not a single grand gesture, but a great many small ones, and Eleanor, true to the discipline that had carried her this far, counted them the way she counted everything else. Gideon began coming to the estate office in the evenings, not to oversee her, but to sit across from her with his own correspondence while she worked, the two of them silent, together, in a way that had, over 3 years, never once been available to them. He moved his chair, one evening in November, from its accustomed place across the room to the one beside her desk, and said nothing about it, and she said nothing about it either, though she noted it, precisely the way she noted every accumulating thing that meant nothing alone and everything together. He began pouring her tea before she asked for it, correctly, the way she took it, which meant he had at some point begun watching closely enough to know. There was one relapse, in December, when a tenant dispute arose over a boundary hedge, and Gideon, out of 3 years' habit, settled it alone with the tenant before thinking to consult her. A small thing, an old reflex, not malice. Eleanor named it plainly that evening, without heat. You decided that without me. It is a small matter, and you decided it well, but it is precisely the habit I asked you to break. He did not argue. He apologized, and the following week brought her a second, larger dispute over drainage rights and set it before her first, waiting, visibly, for her judgment before he offered his own. Proof, she thought, watching him wait, that the correction had taken. He gave her the pearl comb again in January, not across a desk this time, but with his own hands, in her hair, before a dinner neither of them particularly wanted to attend, and said only, not an obligation, this time, and she felt, for the first time in 4 years, something in her chest unclench, that she had stopped expecting to unclench at all. It was in February, by the fire in the room that had once been only his, and was now, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, simply theirs, that he said the thing he had been circling for months. "I would choose you," he said. "Not because the estate requires it, not because it is sensible, though God knows it is that too. I have been choosing you, I think, since the culvert, and every day since, and I expect to go on choosing you for the rest of however long you'll permit me the privilege of it." He paused. "I did not know, until I nearly lost the chance to say it, that a man could choose a thing daily, and have it still feel like the first time each morning." Eleanor did not answer immediately. She thought of her mother, and of ledgers, and of the 20 minutes she had once allowed herself in a retiring room, with a watch pressed into her palm. Then she said, simply, "All right," and when he laughed, a short, startled, entirely undignified sound, the first true laugh she had drawn from him in 4 years of marriage, she found she was laughing too, and that it did not feel, for once, like something she had built. It felt like something that had simply, finally, arrived, 2 years past, and Alderley in that time became a house the county spoke of differently than it once had. The tenant wage Eleanor had instituted became, formalised under her own hand and Mr. Bexley's careful drafting, the estate's standing policy, posted each Lady Day at the estate office door, where every hedger and dairyman could read it for himself. A small school opened in the village that spring, funded from the restitution Mrs. Renshaw had been made to pay, staffed in its first term by Simon Waite, who had given up modistes clerking for the steadier, quieter work of teaching children their letters, at the Duchess's own recommendation. Old Corbett's grandson was apprenticed to the estate's new steward, a plain, honest man named Fenwick, who kept 1 set of books and slept easily for it. Eleanor wore the pearl comb often now, not as a duty discharged, but as a thing she had chosen to keep, its meaning inverted so completely that she sometimes forgot, dressing for an ordinary evening, that it had ever meant anything else at all. The house itself, callers remarked, felt different than it had in the old Duke's time, and different still from the cold, careful years of Gideon's first marriage to it, warmer, less held breath. The particular ease of a place where no one was any longer required to be merely useful in order to be kept. She had stopped, somewhere in that long, slow accumulation of ordinary days, asking to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to unsee, not through gowns bought with someone else's allowance, not through tears at a window, but through 2 years of ledgers that balanced, tenants who were paid fairly, and a composure that had never once, not for a single hour, required anyone's permission to exist. Love, when it finally came to her, came not as rescue, and not as reward, but as a verdict rendered by a man who had learned, at considerable cost, to read the evidence correctly. And that was the particular, quiet arithmetic of the whole matter, not that she had waited to be valued, but that she had made herself the sum no one could any longer miscalculate, and a woman built like that, once finished, is not a thing that can be taken from her again.